Well, hello everyone. Welcome to another video on History By Podcast. And today I'm joined by Professor Robyn Walsh. And today we'll be discussing a little bit about what she's presenting at SBL, but I'm also going to ask some questions about her book. And also, if you feel a link to it, will be in the description below. With that being said, thank you for joining me today, Robyn.
Yeah, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me. It's nice to see you in person.
Yeah, likewise. Can you tell us a little bit about from whom the Codex tolls the cult of difficulty in the Gospel of Mark?
Mm-hmm. So this is for a forthcoming volume, and the session was basically previewing what we're going to be working on. But my central interest in that session is how do we classify the Gospels in terms of their use of koine, and how do we understand the first and second centuries and what we see as the shift from, or between this Atticizing tendency within Greek and the second sophistic. So there's sort of this middle region where the Gospels slot in. And I think there's a tendency within the field to think that anything in koine is, sometimes the terms you'll actually see are things like vulgar or street Greek. I actually quoted a scholar that I won't say who it was in the paper who said, well, only the uneducated are forced to use koine. And when you think about that, it's kind of an odd statement. How are the educated, the people writing uneducated, and how are they being forced to use this particular register? So I wanted to investigate that a little bit more. And the reason it's for whom the Codex tolls is that it's always struck me that we make all these pronouncements about koine and make all these assumptions about it, especially with someone like the Gospel of Mark, whoever wrote the Gospel of Mark. But nobody ever says that about someone like Ernest Hemingway, who really brought in a new kind of writing from this modernism, what's typically called the cult of difficulty. James Joyce, Gertrude Stein, writers like this. He really brought in, because of his journalistic background and his style was, as he would say himself, anybody with a high school education can read what I'm writing. But no one would say he's uneducated. No one would say he's just writing street English, or that he's not engaged with the writing community around him, because he was part of Gertrude Stein's salon in Paris. He's very much part of this really elite group of writers, and considered one of the greatest writers of the 20th century. So I was interested in doing that comparison. Now, a little bit of background is they asked me to do something creative for this. I was just going to sort of do almost like a phenomenological comparison. But my point was, let's talk about a writer who's closer to home with Hemingway, and then go back and reconsider how we talk about koine with the Gospel of Mark. But they asked me to do something a little bit more creative because I had just published an article in the Journal for the Historical Jesus called The Mouse of the Mysteries, where I pretended it's 4025, and I have a scholarly alter ego who's an archaeologist who has uncovered in Orlando, Florida, the remains of what they think is some kind of cult site to a pan-global mouse god, and that in domestic structures all over the world, we're also finding votives of this mouse god. And I basically write this whole entire scholarly article, and I used AI for the images of the archaeological sites and the findings, the small finds, apotropaic mouse watches, and things like that. So I wrote a whole article in that persona, and it was really a pedagogical comment on mistakes we can make if we overread our evidence. So the editors read Mouse of the Mysteries, and they asked me to mouse Hemingway somehow. So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what I would do. And in the course of reading about koine, reading about shifts in literary tone, some people use the word register, in the period, that first, second century, I started reading Lucian's On How to Write History. And some of his advice for how to write a good history or any other kind of writing sound a lot like the Gospels. It's a little strange. I mean, down to don't put your name on it. Direct sentences, have like a chain, just talk about events one after the other. Don't use too much flourish. If you're talking about a landscape, don't overdo it. Don't show off too much. Don't have long titles. So I started to think actually Hemingway and Lucian would have a lot to talk about best practices and good Greek style. Even if you're not Atticizing the way the second sophistic does with their Greek, even writers in Koine are doing many of the same things. So my paper ended up being a fictional dialogue between Lucian and Hemingway on how to write properly or best practices or how to avoid editorial fatigue, which was the title of the session. So I managed to mouse Hemingway in some way, and everything that the two of them recommend, the implication is that that's what the gospel writers do in their work.
That kind of reminds me a bit of your book when you're examining the origins of Christianity in the Greco-Roman context.
Yeah.
You brought up Lucian and how Lucian helps in some way understand the Gospel of Mark, even though Lucian's obviously not a Christian.
And he's obviously much later.
Right.
Right.
Can you expand a bit more on how Lucian helps us understand the Gospels?
Yeah, so, he's a satirist, so I should say that right off the bat. So he's making jokes a lot of the time. He's actually really, really funny. And I make the joke that if I had encountered Lucian earlier, I think I would be in a different career path, possibly, because I could just sit and read him and laugh like a nerd. But he really represents the height of the Second Sophistic, I find, in many ways, both in terms of his skill, but in terms of his engagement. And again, because it's satire, it's like The Daily Show or something. Sometimes the humor is more on point, if you get it, than any other kind of sober analysis. So because he's later, it's a little bit hard to connect him to the Gospels, except for a couple of things. One is I feel that he really represents the pinnacle of that kind of commentary later on, right? So he can do kind of a retrospective for us. Like he hits the benchmark of like somebody who's talking about these issues and doing it really, really well for us to understand what's been going on in the development of Greek literature over that time period. But also he has, in his Passing of Peregrinus, another satirical piece that he wrote, there's this figure Peregrinus for a while actually joins a Christian group and becomes so successful, apparently, that he was one of these major leaders, almost on par with Jesus in some circles. The thing about this story, though, is that he's on the lam because he's been committing a variety of crimes I won't detail. Someone can go read. And the law keeps catching up to him. And the implication is essentially he wants to try to find notoriety somewhere. So he's, I think, a cynic for a while. He's a Christian for a while. Eventually, he lights himself on fire at the Olympic Games. And we have historical attestation of this. Apparently, he's a real person. So he lights himself on fire at the Olympic Games, and he finally gets the fame he was always looking for. At least that's how Lucian tells it. But Lucian's aware of Christians, which is interesting. He's not talking about their literature, but he knows they exist. So he's an interesting person to look at if you're going to be talking about things like craft, which I was doing in this paper, but also in general thinking about later manifestations of Christianity and how it's understood outside of Christian circles.
What does he say about Christians?
Well, Peregrinus, he basically says they're gullible. He says some of the things that you would expect about they share things in common. And one of the reasons that he chooses them when he's on the lam is because he knows they'll pay his legal bills. So because they kind of, they pool their money and they share things and they take care of each other, they're a good mark for a con artist, essentially. So they come across as sort of maybe naive a little bit, I think, in his text, but he's eventually kicked out because he doesn't follow the dietary laws properly. So they eventually catch on to him. So he doesn't say too much, but enough to be interesting.
Do you still think that Q existed?
I don't know for sure. There certainly seems to be enough evidence there to sustain it. Whether or not, the thing for me is that if it did exist, claims that it's before the war, I'm not so sure about. So I think the way that it functions as a theory is to create a chain or a connection to what we would call the historical Jesus. So you can have Q's bridge that gap between Jesus and his followers, or even Paul, who probably has nothing to do with it, but at least that era, all the way to when the Gospels are written, which we all know are post-70, right? And I mean, some people are pushing this into the 2nd century now, that the Gospels are actually 2nd century. So if you have Q as this hypothetical source, you have, and it's associated with oral tradition, right? And then some Q scholars even put it into different layers. So, the wisdom community, the eschatological community, right? The different themes that come up in Q, people will associate with different communities and traditions and even groups. And so it becomes functionally a way to create some kind of genealogy from maybe the earliest groups or some oral tradition to the Gospels. That's the part I find suspicious, because I think it's a stand-in for more apologetic ways of understanding the content of the Gospels. And I don't see a great reason that we have to date it so early. Because, I mean, imagine people are right, the Gospels are 2nd century. Why does Q have to be 50s, right? It could be post-war too, because it has, per the eschatological side, some indications it could be reflecting on the Jewish war as well. So if it existed, I would say it's later.
And that would make sense of statements that it makes, like, something about your house is empty.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Or on sand. I think the temple's on sand or something. I think that passage is in there too. So, yeah, I think there's good reason to doubt or to question.
Now, in the Q material, in the double tradition material, regardless if it existed as a separate document as Q at one point or not, do you see a bunch of things in there that fit within the Greco-Roman context, like that's inspired by Greco-Roman literature?
Well, I mean, certainly a collection of sayings of a teacher. I mean, Pythagoras, right? There's nothing particularly unique about that. So to the extent that it reflects the kind of practice you see in other philosophical groups, absolutely, at least as far as we know.
Does Matthew and Luke having birth stories, genealogies attributed to Jesus, do you also see parallels in Greco-Roman literature?
You have that with a lot of major hero figures, and in biographies, that's fairly typical. There are some atypical things about the Gospels, and I won't give away that Dennis MacDonald's behind the camera, but he might have something to say about this too. I mean, it's a little peculiar, for instance, that we don't have a description of Jesus physically, right? Because there are some formulaic things you expect. Genealogies, birth narratives, some kind of, who was this person's teacher? You get that with Alexander, for example. I mean, we get down to how Alexander smelled. So there are some atypical aspects, but the genealogy, the birth narrative, yeah, that's pretty typical. I mean, the idea that the god sneaks in dressed as the husband or something along those lines, and that explains why the hero's the way he is. That's pretty usual.
Which Greco-Roman mythological figures would you say remind you more of Jesus, or Greco-Roman characters in general?
Alexander does a little bit, because even the way, say, Plutarch writes his life of Alexander, you have some of the wonder elements in it where he's exceptional, but also there's a little bit more of a focus on some of the mundane things about his life. And I think to some extent, you have a little bit of that with Jesus, right? You definitely have like the major aspects of Jesus's life, but he's mostly just walking around teaching and performing small acts, and depending on which gospel you're talking about. So I think that's one thing that stands out to me. And by the way, it's something Lucian recommends, that you don't focus on big events, that you focus on little things too.
Could you name a few more characters that you think remind you of the way the Gospels portray Jesus? Socrates
is another one, especially his death. Let me see, who else? Apollonius of Tyana would be another one. I think there's probably some touchstones with Pythagoras as well, and then Homer. Again, looking at Dennis over there. I think that especially when you think about the literary sources, but what would be influencing the gospel writers, I think all of that is, all that stands out to me.
What were some of the major parallels that really got you going down the path of examining the Greco-Roman origins of the Gospels, like the Greco-Roman context?
Well, okay, so there's two ways to answer that. The first is to talk about structurally. Something that I was interested in was moving us away from always thinking about the Gospels as somehow Jewish literature. And obviously, in some respects, they are, right? I mean, they're citing the Septuagint, and it's obviously a major influence on the Gospels. But by focusing in that direction, I think sometimes scholarship errs on the side of what I would call exceptionalism. So it treats the Gospels as some kind of exceptional form of writing or a new kind of genre that came onto the scene that almost had no precedent anywhere. But by turning to Greco-Roman literature, so someone like Richard C. Miller or someone like Dennis MacDonald working on motifs, on tropes, on structure, narrative structure that you could see in the Gospels that mirrors what's going on elsewhere in the Greco-Roman world, that is key. And to remember that these Gospel writers have enough Greek that they were educated somewhere, sometime, in some capacity, what's traditionally called paideia. They learned off of these other writers. They're writing in Greek. They learned off of Homer. They learned off of philosophy. They learned off of other biographies that are around it whenever you think they were authored. And there are certain structural elements that they definitely mirror. We've talked about a few here already. Something like including a genealogy is one of them, or a birth narrative. And so I think to not understand that we have to situate them within that arc of literature is a mistake. So, Empty Tomb was something that I talked about. I was struck in my book by how many things I saw in the Satyricon that also thematically appear in the Gospels, including 3 men crucified in an empty tomb and a funerary meal with Trimalchio, saying that he wanted, after his death, he hears a cock crow and he says, after my death, I want my friends to divide my body and eat it. I mean, you have all kinds, and those are all what are usually called Milesian tales. And so these were stories that were around before the 1st century in some form or another, being compiled essentially in the Satyricon. So those were things that stood out to me when I was working on this.
When the Gospels are trying to reimagine the historical Jesus within the Greco-Roman context, is that to make Jesus compete, imitate, and be better than other Greco-Roman heroes?
Probably. I have been thinking more about the social situation of the Gospel authors. Sometimes I worry that we overuse the concept of competition. I don't know if it's so much competition as this is just what you do. And so if you want to convey that Jesus is on par with some of these other figures, these are the kind of teachings. This is the kind of activity. Of course, his body would be missing afterwards. In a way, it's kind of showing his place within this panoply of wondrous characters. It's also playing into things people like in this period, from what we can tell in terms of literature, things like wonder stories. People love miracle stories. People love, in this period, paradoxography, which is this form of literature. We give it this title, but it's basically paradoxographers, scholars of this don't like this, but I'm gonna use this analogy. Ripley's Believe It or Not. So, or when I was growing up in supermarkets, when you actually did have like magazines and newspapers at the end of the aisle, there was something called the News of the World. I loved the News of the World, and there was this serial story, this Bat Boy found in cave. I actually have a Bat Boy T-shirt. I loved Bat Boy. So you'd have they found this Bat Boy, and they had some kind of like puppet they made that looked like a bat child, and they would like tell you like, oh, Bat Boy got out again. It was completely all made up. Like dinosaurs are real. Everything was made up in this magazine. And I don't know where it went. I mean, I think it just died like the rest of print. But this thing was fantastic. And it was entertainment. But it was also, like you didn't really believe there was a Bat Boy, but you're sort of like, you can go engage this fantasy world, right, where these things could be possible. And so paradoxography, it's too trite to say it was like News of the World or Ripley's Believe It or Not, but it was a way it's like almost a travel log. It was a way to find out about far off places you're never going to see, you can only imagine about, maybe you've only heard about randomly, but you hear about extraordinary things that can happen there, or extraordinary things that are going on in spaces you don't have access to. So they used to say things like, there's a centaur that was found in such and such a place. They embalmed it and brought it back to the emperor, and it's now in his storehouse. Like, you can never prove that, but it's interesting to think about, right? So in a period where these wonder tales are really compelling, to hear about this far-off land, Judea, with this guy who has these essentially magical powers, again, like just to kind of use some shorthand, but is able to do these really extraordinary things, heal people, multiply food, to, talk to spirits, to cast them into swine. Like all of these things fit, I think, within that scope of interest for people.
So how many Greco-Roman heroes actually have a story about a missing body?
Well, Miller had some number, like 120 or something like that. I found even more when I was doing my research, in part because I also looked at the Greek novel, which I don't know that there's been enough comparison to the Greek novel, which arises roughly the same period that we ballpark the Gospels. And they're often written in Latin too, just so people know to call them the Greek novels is just kind of a shorthand, but they were essentially like proto-Shakespearean romantic novels. And they have things like empty tombs all the time. So I think I talked about, might have been Keraton was one, where it's a star-crossed lover story where, young boy and girl, their eyes meet, they fall in love. She dies under some kind of mysterious circumstances. She's put in a tomb. Her would-be boyfriend goes to the tomb when he hears that she's died to like pay respect to her, and her body's missing from the tomb. Turns out pirates raided the tomb, stole all the jewels, and took her too. But he automatically thinks, oh, she's become a god. That's what happened. Which god stole my girlfriend to like make her his girlfriend? So those kinds of stories were also prolific. And so to the things that Miller adds about deities and, the usual thing, the apotheosis, emperors, or I think Asclepius might even, I'm glancing at Dennis to see, but I think there are other like Pan-Hellenic heroes that even get this kind of like, the body disappears story, but also obviously emperors. They would look for cosmic signs too, which are present in the Gospels, that there's some kind of earthquake, some kind of shooting star, some kind of comet, something that indicates to you that, the individual whose body has disappeared has shot off to heaven, what we might call heaven, or there's some kind of cosmic event that has taken place. That's something you see in the Gospels too.
It makes one wonder if that's where they got the inspiration from to create that.
Totally.
Right.
Of course. Of course. But they would say, I think that, I can't remember which one, but there's a Roman emperor where there was a comet after he died, and everyone was like, oh, there he is. Like this was, this was pretty typical.
It was either Julius Caesar or Augustus.
Yeah, was it Caesar?
Okay. The first one was right.
Yeah. So, this is just, it's just what happens. So the idea that you would have an earthquake or something, like that shows the power and weight of what's taken place, totally normal.
Do you see this as complicating or helping to understand, to try to, in any attempt to reconstruct the historical Jesus by separating all that which was clearly added to his character from the Greco-Roman context?
I'm increasingly convinced that anything we would want to call the historical Jesus is pretty lost to us, save some like large strokes. So, that he existed, he was a Judean, that he had some kind of a following, that I tend to suspect it was more of maybe kind of rebellious sort of group along the lines of what Josephus describes with some of these other sons of God claiming some kind of exalted status to fight against their occupation. But I think that beyond kind of understanding that he was probably a teacher type of some kind, there's not much that we can really know. But I think that is a function of our expectations not lining up with what these people were trying to do. I think that we want a historical Jesus for a variety of reasons. A lot of it proof text for some belief that someone is holding, which is fine. Except if you look to these texts for confirmation, I think you're going to be disappointed once you start to realize everything we've been talking about, all the structural elements that come into play for understanding the literature. Really, the goal was to give you an impression of this person and their life and their character in a way that corresponded with literary expectation of its era. And that's very different from trying to understand, what did Jesus actually say? Did he say this? Did he say that? where did he go? What's the geography? You're just going to be disappointed if you hang on to that.
But so he tells him not to be afraid. He's going to have a baby. It's going to be an empire, and so on. And Virgil knows that story. That is the model for the three annunciations that we have in Luke's infancy narrative and why it differs from Matthew. The first is to Zechariah about John the Baptist. What happens? He's alone in the temple. He's told his wife is going to have a baby. He doesn't believe her, and so he's punished because of it, like Anchises was. The next one is to Zechariah. So that's Zechariah, then Mary, and then the shepherds. And in each case, you have an angel. People are afraid. They're told not to be afraid. There's going to be a baby, and to Mary, and he's going to have an empire that doesn't end. It's almost a quotation.
All right, we're back, everybody. So, Dennis and Robyn, thank you both for joining me. So, Robyn, I'd like to ask you first, what do you think about Dennis's work on the Homeric influences upon the Gospels?
I think it's perfect. I think that, the level of detail he's able to demonstrate in terms of let's just call them structural similarities, even with some of these narratives, is so impressive. And, with every iteration, he's already done amazing work even well before kind of getting us down to the most recent books with your press, with the Mimesis Press. We were already seeing so much evidence for what he has laid out, but these last two works have been exceptional. And, I'll say this because I can't just fawn over you the entire time, which is, this is the point that I was bringing up before, which is this is what these people learned on, right? So even if we don't know if every single element is an expression from something that they have inferred from Homeric literature, etc., it still proves the point that this is the intellectual environment we have to put these guys into.
I want to respond.
Go ahead.
Robyn, you have not said what's most important about your work and how groundbreaking it is. What you're doing is revolutionary for gospel studies.
I'm just following what you did.
No, you're not. You're on your own because we don't agree on everything, and that's what scholars are about. But one of the most important parts of your book was to challenge the notion that the Gospels emerged out of Christian communities that had memories, and they were kind of, Jewish folklore and all of this, and you related it to German Romanticism. I think there's another way to talk about that, but you're certainly true. It is certainly the case that has disguised how these Gospels were created and how they would have been read by these readers. So you challenge the notion of communities of discourse rather than the readership is more important than the idea of a community. And the level of sophistication of these authors should not be overlooked. Yeah. And I want people who are watching this to know that it's not just that you're clever and articulate and well-read. It's actually that you're revolutionary in the field, and you're not alone. I mean, I'm on the same page.
Yes.
But I think it is so important that these paradigm shifts take place, and it makes a lot of sense about a lot of things. And I want to raise a question to you, which we've never talked about.
Thank you for the compliments, by the way.
No, it's okay. You're welcome. I mean, it was intended to be, but it was really intended for the audience to understand that what you're saying is not just a clever new way of looking at these things, but it really represents a seismic paradigm shift. Mm. And it is so important. I think we need to break up also the idea that the Gospels are intended to be biographies.
Yeah, I agree with you.
I think what I'm talking about in my recent work is that these are founding myths.
Yes.
And to some extent, they're rivals to Virgil's Aeneid, which is the great founding myth of the Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. And the Greek texts that Virgil uses in the Aeneid are frequently similar to the models that we find in the Gospels. And I want to give an example that we've never talked about, that is the infancy narratives. There's a marvelous Homeric hymn called the Homeric Hymn to Aphrodite, which is about the conception of Aeneas. And we know that Virgil knows that story and uses it as a way of talking about the divine conception of Aeneas and then the founding of the Roman Empire, the dynasty that leads to Augustus. And I'm just going to give a very simple version of the story. Zeus talks Aphrodite, who's the love goddess, to lust after Anchises, the Trojan. And she disguises herself as a mortal. And Anchises sees how beautiful she is. And he says, "Oh, you must be a goddess." "Oh, no, 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 my boy. I'm just a mortal. And you have nothing to fear." So they make love. And then she reveals her beauty. And he says, I'm in big dookie. And she says, "No, I'm going to bear you a son. And he and his children's children will rule forever. And if you tell people that you conceived by me, or that I conceived by you, I'm going to punish you." But so he tells him not to be afraid. He's going to have a baby. It's going to be an empire, and so on. And Virgil knows that story. That is the model for the three annunciations that we have in Luke's infancy narrative and why it differs from Matthew. The first is to Zechariah about John the Baptist. What happens? He's alone in the temple. He's told his wife is going to have a baby. He doesn't believe her, and so he's punished because of it, like Anchises was. The next one is to Zechariah. So that's Zechariah, then Mary, and then the shepherds. And in each case, you have an angel. People are afraid. They're told not to be afraid. There's going to be a baby, and to Mary, and he's going to have an empire that doesn't end. It's almost a quotation. And the reason that that's important is, I think Luke is making Jesus, and to some extent John the Baptist, rivals to the Aeneid. And that's why in Luke, when he has his genealogy, it goes all the way back to God. Right? And not to Abraham.
Yeah.
That's what happens in the Iliad.
Interesting.
Where the Anchises, so it's Aeneas, Anchises, and then you find it all the way back to Zeus. And he's got his mother is Aphrodite, or Venus. And it's that kind of playfulness and that is missing in so much biblical scholarship. You don't see these models. And so I think, I guess my basic question to you, are the Gospels biographies, or are they founding myths that are competitive in the intellectual marketplace?
So this is really important for the audience, that what we consider these genre classifications did not exist.
That's right.
In antiquity. So when we get obsessed, not you and me necessarily, but when we hear people get obsessed, it's a biography, it's a history, we have to remember that it's much more agile and dynamic. And so they are playing with a lot of different ideas. We talked about paradoxography a minute ago in my talk, one-on-one. But you're absolutely right. The foundational myth is absolutely part of what is going on here. Somebody that I think you must have known, we have the same mentors, interestingly, from Harvard, but Mimi Palmer Bonds. Her
Luke, sure, yeah, that very important book.
Yeah, that Luke Acts as the legacy of Luke Acts. It's something like legacy in Luke Acts. But she talks about this as well, and also talks about how it's not just Greco-Roman literature, actually. We have other examples within Judaism of similar kinds of activity going on. What's interesting, though, is exactly what you point out, which is how much I think Homer and Virgil are influencing the gospel writers. And they're doing that, as I've pointed out, maybe because of their educational background, or maybe just because this is where you go, right?
And this is what the culture is doing. Yeah.
Exactly, for the kind of gravity you want to achieve for this figure that you're trying to establish, this is where you go. And it's not just Luke, because you know that I have this piece that I just recently wrote about how I think Mark is reading Virgil.
Oh, absolutely. I agree with you.
Right.
And I think Mark is a founding myth.
Yeah, I think so too. And he doesn't have the same biographical elements of the birth narrative and all of that. But the way that wonder is constructed, Thalma is constructed in Mark, is exactly what you find in Virgil, and Virgil's reading Homer, right? So, but the way that certain characters in Virgil, there's a misrecognition of them, not just the kind of misrecognition in Homer, but that it instills some kind of wonderment to the point of being baffled to the point of insanity.
Right? Let me give you another example.
Okay.
The Aeneid ends with the death of Turnus, but the reader knows what's going to happen after that. Turnus was the last defender of the Italians when against the Trojans. Aeneas is going to marry Princess Lavinia. The Italians and Trojans are going to meld into a common core. Trojans will lose their identity, they'll become Romans, and so on. At the end of the Gospel of Mark, we have an ending that is weird. Jesus does not appear to his disciples and so on. But we do have foreshadowing. Mm-hmm. In chapters 13 and 14, with the predictions, the so-called apocalypse and so on, it also is foreshadowing. So the reader knows what's going to happen afterwards. There's going to be a Jewish war, the people are going to suffer, Jesus is coming back, and so on. So I think there are so many possible affinities. And this issue of foreshadowing, I think, is so important. We have foreshadowing also in the Iliad. The Iliad ends with the death of Hector and his burial. But the reader knows, because of foreshadowing, what's going to happen afterwards. Troy's going to fall, you're going to have the Trojan horse, and you're going to have the Achaeans leaving, and so on. So these larger patterns, here's another piece that you didn't mention about your work that is so important. Biblical scholars have been too anal, in my view, sorry.
It's just a Freudian term, it's part
in understanding philology to be semantics and grammar and so on. Philology includes imitation, it includes creativity, it includes a cultural connection, and it's dynamic. And what you're pointing to in your work, and I trust that I am, is that we need to enrich the discussion of interpretation of literature as though it's literature, and not simply get caught in the
it's a tool for something else, or a modern objective.
And it's so much more fun to see how this literature functions culturally. And,
one other thing, too, that if we think about these materials as literature, to the point about genre a little bit, is we also tend to treat these things like they circulated as a whole in the form that we imagine them, and we analyze them and philologically too sometimes, as if this thing that we open up in the Nestle Aland is the thing that was out there, when we know that people sometimes would only have what we would call a chapter, right? A chapter or two, or some segment of something. So it wasn't like you were absorbing all of this material at once necessarily in the way that even the community reconstruction would presuppose, right? There's an entire cohesive narrative that's been memorized, or a set of, ideas or stories that go in a certain kind of progression, and we have to hold on to that progression.
How many cities would have had 48 rules of Homeric epic?
Right.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Or, what we find preserved sometimes in the rare instances, there's something in a domestic structure or even in a trash heap. It's a couple of pages of something, right? Not necessarily the whole thing. Because the truly, truly elite are purchasing what we would call books, codices, and collecting them at that level. And that's not everybody, right? But we do know that there are more people reading than perhaps we give credit for. The book itself is an important idea of showing somebody's elite membership and just societal expectations or cultural narratives.
And some books are more popular than others, and they get shared.
More than others. Yeah, exactly. So we have to have a much more flexible idea of this as literature for that reason, too. Yeah.
Today we're discussing her contribution to the next quest for the historical Jesus, entitled City and Country. And so that's what we're going to be discussing today. That being said, thank you for joining me today, Robyn.
Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
My first question that I'd like to ask is, when you wrote your contribution and you titled it City and Country, what did you want people to focus on regarding cities and countries? What's the point that you were jiving at?
It's actually the reverse situation where I was asked to contribute and then told that was my topic. And so I didn't actually choose that topic or that title, but I was asked to meditate on that question of, in the quest for the historical Jesus, how does city and country come into play? The way I ended up approaching it was to think in terms of literary strategy. So when we see cities and countries represented in different kinds of imperial literature, and other kinds of literature too, but in this particular time period of the Gospels, what are some of the themes that come out, or what are some of the main ways that those locations are treated, again, within the text itself? I think there's a way in which you could probably approach the topic in talking about archaeology or the historical Galilee or something like that. What I decided to do instead, though, was look at how when Jesus moves from the country to the city within the Gospels, what are some of the things that tend to happen, and what do I see as some of the predominant literary themes that I think we often underappreciate. And I don't think that's too strong to say if we're looking for the Gospels to tell us something different about history in those locations.
What is different about, in your view, what is different about what this book sets up about the next quest for the historical Jesus versus prior quests for the historical Jesus in scholarship?
I think that in this particular case, especially under the guidance of Chris Keith and James Crossley, who are the editors of the volume and who selected the contributors or invited them, there was a concerted effort, and of course I'm not speaking for them, but I think there was an effort to do a little bit less of the kind of historical Jesus research or approach to the historical Jesus that's trying to determine things like, what did he really say or not really say? What are the historical, quote unquote, facts we can derive out of something like the Gospels? And, I understand it can be a little bit confusing sometimes, I think, it sounds like we're both saying that the Gospels can be used as historical documents, but there's no historical value to them, right? And I think sometimes historical Jesus research has had difficulty articulating itself along those lines. I think that it's a matter of trying to focus our lens slightly differently on the material, and that's what's happened in this book, which is looking at topics like city and country in a way that isn't trying to have the age-old debate about what is the historical value of the Gospels for saying something about ancient Jerusalem and so forth, but to say, in terms of what these writers are doing and what they're driving at in the Gospels, in terms of their characterization of Jesus, here are the things that we can identify as historical strategies of authorship. At least that was my reading of it. So it was a much more critical, I think, historically critical view of the historical Jesus project. Very far away from something like the Jesus Seminar, for example, if some of your viewers know what that project was in the 20th century, which was really much more focused on treating these documents as historically reliable in very particular ways and trying to extract that history out of them.
What is your methodology for researching the historical Jesus? And my second part to that question is if you were to research try to discern a historical Jesus from the literary tropes that you've seen in the Gospels when comparing them to Greco-Roman literature, like Virgil or other texts adjacent to Virgil. How would you distinguish between when the Gospels are being literary and when they're being real about Jesus?
Well, I think we've probably talked about this before. Actually, I think we talked about this in November. I got the pleasure of seeing you at the Society of Biblical Literature conference, which is that our understanding of history is different today, in part, I think theoretically, than in antiquity, in the sense that in antiquity, I'm not sure they were as concerned with extracting from these texts some kind of concrete fact that can be wielded for other purposes. So I think for my own methodology and approach, I have a much more flexible understanding of what I can get out of these texts. And so when I do try to identify literary tropes, it's not so much. So for example, in this piece, in the chapter, I compare the way that Jesus is misunderstood or misrecognized or not recognized in the Gospel of Mark, which is usually characterized as the messianic secret. I talk about that in terms of other heroes in the Homeric tradition and the Virgilian tradition, and within Greco-Roman literature, something like the novel, where heroes are often not recognized, or when the hero goes from the country to the city, usually something corrupting happens or something bad happens to the hero. So I'm thinking here about someone like Aesop or Socrates, right? Like usually the city is corrupting. When I see those themes in the text, what I'm interested in is really, I guess you could say, the historical author and what they want us to derive about their understanding of Jesus. So when they use those kinds of motifs, they're trying to tell us about a way to interpret the character that they're writing about, in this case, Jesus. Now, that's not to say Jesus isn't a historical person or, to go into that morass, because this is a kind of thing that writers do for all kinds of figures, historical figures, including people like the emperors, just for example. So that's what I'm trying to look at. So maybe that would be the shift we would say, is I'm looking at the historical author and what they want us to take out of the person they're talking about and why they're interested in us drawing those conclusions, more so than a contemporary historical idea of like, this is fact and this is fiction, and where is that line and how do I extract that from the text? I'm not sure that's what the text is trying to do.
What kind of complications do you see in any attempt to try to with the goal in any journey to try to reconstruct the historical Jesus? Given what you've said, that there's a lot of Greco-Roman influence on the Gospels, the literary tropes are very similar. Is it even possible to actually meet the goals of a quest like this, in your view? Can it be done, or is it hopeless?
So in this case, you're thinking like the traditional quest to be able to say concrete things about the historical Jesus. Is that what you mean? Like, can we do that particularly? Yeah. I mean, I think what becomes, maybe we could say, like, not satisfying particularly about that effort is that you have to be content with pretty broad strokes. I think we can say some pretty general things about the historical Jesus, in the sense that we think he really existed. We really think that he was a man from Judea. We really think he was Jewish. He had a certain number of followers. He was in a tradition of someone like John the Baptist, even if the idea that he was his cousin or he was his teacher is maybe fabricated. We can debate that. Those kinds of things. He went to Jerusalem. He was crucified, right? We can reconstruct some of those things. But they are, again, pretty broad. And then when you delve into the details, that's where you can start to have debates about, how much does this one aspect look like some kind of literary trope, or maybe it is historical, but it's been presented as a literary trope. And I think we just have to be flexible and open-minded about it. But it's not going to get you, I think, the really, fine grain and quote unquote reliable information. And I think that's how, a lot of different kinds of interpretations can emerge about that project. That it takes all kinds of different, there are different facets to how that project can be perceived. In part because, we have to be comfortable with ambiguity and just general information. So I don't think we can derive as much as people want, but I think we can say a few things.
So now I want to ask you about Mark's Christology. What is his Christology?
This is an interesting question. So, I mean, there's various ways I could answer this. One thing that I do, if I could go back to the piece that we're talking about in the volume that I wrote, because I do focus on Mark. So one thing that I talk about there is that in terms of Mark's Christology, it has been very, I think, defined by the work of a scholar named Verda, who wrote a book in German that was then translated about what he generally calls the messianic secret. So this idea in Mark that people don't seem to recognize Jesus until a certain point of the text. So he performs these miracles or these other kind of wondrous acts, and the witnesses around, and even the disciples, often the disciples are called dim-witted, don't seem to understand the significance of what they're seeing or who Jesus was. And so he describes this as a Christological strategy, and he does it, in my view, in very psychological, kind of almost Freudian terms when you read the book, that like this is what Jesus is thinking and this is what Jesus wants, really personalizing the character in the Gospel of Mark. But he defines this as a Christological perspective that sees Jesus as, some people will say, a reluctant Messiah, that he knows once he's revealed as who he is, he's going to be crucified, and he's trying to delay that. Or that kind of Christology would be like a low Christology, that he seems more human in the text. There's also debates about how to make sense of the fact that the baptism seems to be the thing that makes him God's son, and there isn't a genealogy in Mark, that kind of perspective. My take on this, and what I talk about in the chapter, is that the Messianic secret really doesn't get us at that literary strategy that I'm talking about. It seems to do so in the sense that it's describing something that happens in the text. But if you do look at something like the lack of recognition of who Jesus is, especially after he performs miracles throughout the Gospel of Mark, then it looks much more like something you would find in Homer when the hero goes home and no one knows who he is. And in my case, I argue that it looks very much like Virgil, where there are subversive figures who, someone like Camilla, who will come into a town, and the language, even though in Latin, it has the exact same kind of resonance as you have in the Gospel of Mark. In Mark, the Greek word is thauma, which means something akin to wonder or amazement, sometimes even confusion or bewilderment. That same language and those same constructions, and I show many comparisons in the chapter, is exactly what you see in the Gospel of Mark. So I would say the Christology tends to be classified as a low Christology, one of a Jesus and his disciples struggling through the humanity of what he is about to face, and all of that may be a correct theological interpretation. On the literary register, however, it's a very, very common trope, I would say, or a common strategy or structure to have this kind of wonder language surrounding a hero who's not being properly acknowledged, or who is so unique that it's very confusing for the eyewitnesses, and in a way then the eyewitnesses, and in this case the disciples as well in Mark, become avatars for the reader. Especially if you're being introduced to Jesus for the first time, you're going to also be mesmerized, confused, maybe even doubtful about the kind of miracles that are being described and the activities being described. And so that as a literary strategy leads you as a reader also on a process of recognition. And so I wouldn't really describe that as Christology, but for those who like that kind of term, I think that's what's going on in terms of Verda's interpretation.
So who exactly is Phlegon? And can you give us a couple of examples of where Phlegon has strong parallels with the Gospel of Mark?
Sure. So he is an ancient paradoxographer. And paradoxography in antiquity were usually collections of some miraculous, noteworthy, or extraordinary events. And we actually, have a few examples of this, and sometimes this kind of literary activity is embedded in other kinds of texts. But in that case, we have an actual collection of his works that have only been translated, I think, once by a man named Hansen. So we do have an English translation, but it's also available in Greek. It's been preserved, his work. And what it looks like is almost like a saying source. And depending on how it's been compiled, in the case of Hansen's translation, he did it by theme, and some of the Greek looks like this as well. that I've looked at. But he'll collect different kinds of extraordinary, like ephemera. So you'll see something like long-lived persons, and he'll give a list of locations where he's heard somebody who lived for an extraordinary long time and how long they lived, and give you some like small details about their lives sometimes just like the one line about I heard somebody in such a place lived to be 120 years old, something like that. But he also gives details that, sort of smack of like Herodotus or somebody like that, about extraordinary things that happened in far off places too. So he'll talk about, I think the example I give in the chapter was a taxidermied centaur. I think that was the example, but a taxidermied centaur that is in the storehouse of the emperor. And so that taxidermied centaur shows that centaurs are real. It's from an exotic place, and so your imagination can run wild with that kind of information. But it is just sort of a compendium of all these sort of extraordinary facts and figures, places, and it's engaging because it again activates the imagination, and it's kind of curiosity, a set of curiosities.
How is Jesus presented as a literary thelma in the Gospels?
Well, in Mark, he will come into a particular place and say perform a healing or other kind of extraordinary activity. And what Mark says is that the people around him are bewildered. And so I think I gave maybe 3 different examples of this in the Gospel of Mark. And so that, along with the disciples' inability to really understand who he is until I think it's something like chapter 8, right? Like there's a fulcrum where the dialogue changes. Peter says, he says something like, who do people say I am? And then Peter gives the list, and after that he moves towards the city, and it becomes clearer what his mission, so-called, is going to be. So that is what happens, I think, in the Gospel of Mark specifically. You see the word elsewhere in the Gospels, and indeed throughout Greek and Roman literature. But in the Gospel of Mark specifically, what again is usually called the messianic secret, this idea that people aren't quite sure who he is, that is specifically using that language of thelma whenever it takes place in the text.
What exactly is the messianic secret?
So it's the way that this man, William Verda, argues for trying to understand the curious aspect of the Gospel of Mark where it seems that people aren't quite sure who he is. So that term is something he titles his book, originally it was in German, but that's how he titles his book. I think that as a description of one of these features of the Gospel of Mark, it's actually it's apt in the sense that it seems that there is some kind of secrecy in the Gospel of Mark. Again, back to what we were talking about with Christology, that there's a reason, for some reason, Mark wants Jesus to be this more mysterious figure. Unlike something, say, the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus explains his teachings in a much more clear way. There isn't this ambiguity about what he means. Matthew will tell you where in the Holy Scriptures you can refer back to understand the context of Jesus as something like a new Moses. Luke, of course, much more literary, gives you much more context for many of the scenes. He adds a lot more detail than Mark does. But even in Mark's sentence structure, it's very much shrouded in kind of, I said ambiguity, but also like the brevity of it leaves a lot open to the reader to interpret. And this goes all the way to the ending of Mark, which I'm sure you've had people on the show before talking about the original ending versus the longer ending. But just to make sure everyone's on the same page, the Gospel of Mark originally ended, at least the older versions of it that we have, with the women afraid and running away. And so that as an ending continues the theme throughout Mark of a sense of secrecy, or at least not this lack of clarity of Jesus, who he was, the significance of what's happening. People just seem sort of confused. And as an ending, for the women to run away confused and say nothing to anyone, that's a terrible ending if you're trying to explain how Christianity eventually, makes it out into the empire and everyone finds out about Jesus. So at some point, someone added a longer ending of Mark with the appearances and so forth, right? And it was kind of an answer to that larger schema of mystery in the text. So that's generally what people mean by it. But again, it's a description, but I don't know that it's one that fully attends to where you see that kind of thematic inflection or strategy in other texts like Virgil.
Can you tell us about Francois Bowen's suggestion that Luke has an affinity for dates?
That's really funny. I mean, he's the one, Luke, who is trying to ground, at least, at certain points in his gospel. I think this is what you mean. Like Quirinius, right, as governor of Syria. Like he tries to throw in those details throughout. Is that what you're referring to?
Yes.
Yeah. So affinity for dates is a charming way to put it. We might have talked. Francois was one of my professors, so we were quite close. I actually helped him with his Luke books, a few of them. Like those were my first publications. And so I think he does, affinity is a nice way, I think, and I don't want to speak again for Francois, but a nice way of saying that Luke tries to put in those kinds of details for sure and ground the text in a way, say Mark doesn't, right? The problem, of course, is that a lot of the dates don't seem quite right, but that is a nice illustration of what we've been talking about in terms of how much can you extract from these texts about history, about a concrete history. Just because Luke might be a little confused about when Quirinius was governor doesn't mean he's not kind of correct about something, right? Like he's ballparking it, and if you have a flexible mindset and you're not trying to hold him to task too firmly, he's giving you some interesting information that sounds reasonable and credible enough. So I think that's the affinity there. To, as a reader, you feel a little more secure.
So now I want to shift back to Mark. How does Mark, can you talk about Mark's portrayal of Jesus as a wonder worker?
Yeah, I mean, he's an interesting wonder worker in the text. And I mean, this maybe not what you are thinking of, but one thing that always stands out to me is I'm one of the scholars who's fairly persuaded by the idea that probably Mark, whoever he was aware of the letters of Paul at some point. How much of Paul's corpus, I don't know. Which specific letters, I don't know. But I think that it's fair to say that how he constructs things like the healings and the wonder working requires an understanding of Middle Platonic ideas in philosophical physics, especially Stoicism, that is also prevalent throughout Paul's letters. And we've talked about this before. So the way that the healings tend to work is that in the Greek, it's sometimes instead of a specific disease or a demon, it's something like bad pneuma is the word in the Greek. And so Jesus is actually dispatching that bad pneuma through his God-given pneuma. There's all kinds of stuff that we associate with the word spirit that gets a little bit more concrete, as I say, in terms of things like Stoic physics, if you look at the 1st and 2nd centuries. So with that in mind, it's very interesting to me that a lot of the wonder working in Mark on Jesus's behalf, which include things, again, like demon healings and getting rid of demons or talking to demons, that's the kind of stuff that it seems to me when Paul talks about his pneumatic demonstrations in his letters could be similar to what he is thinking about there, because he's also talking about things like speaking in tongues in that text and other kinds of activities that are generally spirit or pneuma driven. And so that's one interesting aspect of the text that I see, that it's usually almost always with the wonder working some kind of spirit or pneuma, or the other word you sometimes see is power, so dunamis in Greek. One example that always stands out to me actually is in Mark 5, if I could get specific. So the hemorrhaging woman, if you look at the text, it's very interesting. The woman touches Jesus's garment and a power shoots out of him almost passively. because of her pistis, her faith. So she has sufficient faith so that when she grabs the cloak, power emanates out of Jesus. And you always get the sense that, it's behind him, that he's passed by, and then she grabs onto him. And then she gets kind of this jolt, is sort of how I imagine it, because she has that precondition of faith to receive power from Jesus. And he turns around and he says, who touched me? Like, what was that, essentially? So you get this idea of powers, spirits, other kinds of activity that are active in this world that is being created by Mark, that Jesus has a mastery over for sure. But also in a case like the hemorrhaging woman, he didn't intentionally even heal her. But he's so imbued with this God-given power and this God-given spirit that he's able to do these things, even if it is just behind his back.
Can you talk about some of the parallels between Jesus and Aesop, Moses, Odysseus, and others that you talk about? And feel free to give a couple of specific examples if you want.
Sure. I think that I mentioned Aesop and Socrates before. So in terms of this idea of city and country, I mentioned that usually the city is kind of corrupting on some level for many figures. And I'm sure people listening will think of other examples. And we don't even have to focus on Jesus to think about this. I mean, one other character is John the Baptist, right? Once he leaves the Jordan and leaves the Galilee, or, these areas, more rural areas, where he's living this ascetic life, trouble brews. And so you see that with someone like Socrates or Aesop, and other scholars have written about this. I think one scholar who has is Paul Robertson, that many things related to the death of, say, Socrates looks like what you have in the Gospels, including things like a cock crowing before death as being almost like a herald of death. And I think in Socrates' case that he was charged with his kind of philosophical teachings corrupting the youth. That's something you see a version of that attributed to someone like Paul in the Acts of Paul. And it's not that Jesus was necessarily corrupting the youth, but that idea of what Jesus' teachings are being subversive, or him being a subversive figure, I think also holds. And then the other thing with Aesop, of course, too, he travels around, so switching to Aesop, but he's a subversive figure. I had a chapter about this in my book on the origins of Christian literature. I think it's the last chapter where I talk about other subversive figures, and Aesop is one of my main examples. He's also getting by on his wits. For the most part. He's not supposed to be attractive at all, but he still seems to attract because of his message, his wittiness, and the quality of his teachings, essentially, attention. And Jesus is a wonder worker, yes, in Mark, but he is also a teacher. And it's the quality of those ideas, his philosophical reflections, but also his ethics that he brings forward as he goes around. Although, of course, in Mark, as we've been talking about, is a little more esoteric. But he does give these teachings, and people are attracted to that. And so he does look like these other figures in that respect. And you mentioned Moses. I mean, I think if we imagine Matthew using Mark as a quote-unquote source, when he goes to write his gospel, which is generally held by the field, he does make Jesus look like Moses in a number of ways. One is that Jesus tends to give sermons in the Gospel of Matthew, more than sort of one-off teachings, which is what you have in Mark, which I think of as more characteristic of someone like an Aesop. And I think, too, you have something like the Sermon on the Mount, which I think we tend to associate with whatever image we have of, let's call it a historical Jesus. But remember, it's Sermon on the Mount in Matthew. It's Sermon on the Plain in Luke, right? So you put Jesus on a mountain to essentially give his own version of the commandments, but his twist on the traditional, 10 commandments, or these rules of living, is that not only do you have to uphold sort of the Mosaic law, but he says he's here to intensify it. So it's not only that you can't commit adultery, you shouldn't even look at your neighbor's spouse. It's not that you shouldn't, harbor any kind of ill will to your neighbor, but like if that's even in your heart, that's bad enough, never mind acting on it, right? So he keeps saying that he's here to intensify. So he gives, in the end, I think 5 sermons in Matthew, so 5 books of Moses. He intensifies the law on a mountain, just the way Moses did. with the Ten Commandments. So those kinds of echoes are there to tell you about an interpretation the author has of the kind of Jesus he wants to put forward. But it's also there, I think, as an indication of how you, as the reader, as the audience, is supposed to understand this figure, which is particularly interesting if we think outside of the idea of these texts being written by and for a community of fellow Christians, and think about how these texts also functioned in a broader society in the ancient Mediterranean world. If you are encountering Jesus for the first time, then you're getting a very interesting interpretation of how you're supposed to understand him as a historical figure, but also as somebody worthy of attention.
So when you say that when Jesus is walking on water or going to the Gennesaret and doing other healings, and you say that these are Mark putting in details that are Herodotus-like facts, what do you mean by that?
Well, Herodotus loved to pepper his texts with, random facts, not quite like a paradoxographer, but he's sort of known, there's kind of a whole kettle of fish here, but he was sort of known to give more extraordinary facts that were a little bit more dubious maybe, or harder to believe than, say, Thucydides. So often Herodotus is compared to Thucydides. A great scholar who's written on this is Suzanne Marchand, who just had an article come out about Thucydides and Herodotus, and she points out there that Thucydides is associated often with like a sober kind of history writing that's very serious, that tries to give you an accurate account without too much fluff or too many extraordinary kind of dubious events, versus Herodotus, who was eventually, by the Victorian era, actually turned into children's books. So that's the kind of quality of history we're talking about, at least how it was interpreted by the Victorian era, because there would be more extraordinary tales. I think he opens up with a tale about somebody who rode a dolphin hundreds of miles across the ocean, that kind of thing. And so I think when you consider that you're being asked in the Gospels to accept some pretty extraordinary ideas, you're being asked to accept things like somebody raising someone from the dead. Obviously, these are things that if at first blush you're not accustomed to this kind of storytelling, or you're not already sort of initiated into understanding the significance of Jesus in human history and so forth, that's going to be a bit of a challenge and kind of on par with some of the extraordinary things that Herodotus tells you.
Can you tell us about how did Megan Henning influence your contribution?
Oh, that's a great question. By the way, I see my lights flickering. There's a thunderstorm outside, so if you lose me, I apologize ahead of time.
Oh, no problem.
She has done extraordinary work in the realms of things like disability studies. But as well in this particular volume, I believe she did something on books as objects. And I saw that as an interesting corollary to something that I was trying to drive at, which is the way that something like the Gospel of Mark and the idea of the book itself can be a location for thinking through the significance of the kind of themes that I think the whole volume is dealing with. So I've really appreciated her work in that realm. But I've appreciated her work even more broadly outside of this volume on disability studies. And also she had a recent book on constructions of hell that was very challenging, but really, I think, revolutionary. And so I encourage everybody to check out her work. It's truly excellent. And she's a great contributor to this volume as well.
So my final question, what conclusion did you put forth that you want people to pay attention to when looking at the Gospels and trying to find any historical kernel of truth, but also looking at the complexity of the complications, that is, of the fact that the Gospels are filled with Greco-Roman literary tropes?
Well, I would say if I could indulge in like a two-prong answer to that, one would be to not be content with our traditional ways of classifying the Gospels in terms of something like, say, the Messianic secret, but also thinking purely in terms of something like a Christology. Because if we expand our thinking and do more of the kind of comparative work we've been talking about, then I think you can start to deconstruct something like the so-called messianic secret and understand it in a new key. And I think that that adds to our theoretical understanding of the historical value of something like the Gospels. I would hope that one thing that comes out of this volume as a whole is the benefit of a self-reflection. And I think that the field is doing a self-reflection through this volume and through the efforts of someone like Chris Keith and James Crossley to really understand how do we change traditional ways of approaching these materials to have new approaches, new methods, and new conversations. And we've been talking again today just because of my personal academic interests and how you can reimagine literature and the Gospels as literature. And that is one, not particularly new per se, but one way that I think that we can try to have, again, new conversations that aren't rooted purely in seeing these as quote unquote religious texts or seeing these only through a lens of religious practice, but also trying to reincorporate the Gospels into this larger panoply of ancient Mediterranean literature where they belong, because it's at the deficit of both fields like classics and religious studies to not always keep that into account or take that into account when we're evaluating the Gospels, because there are ways that we can just be too myopic or look too much at the theological significance and not the literary significance of these works.
So, for those that haven't seen your previous appearances on this channel and others, and don't know about your work, can you give a brief recap regarding what your book is about?
Sure. So I was trying to figure out why it is the case that we tend to talk about early Christian literature, and specifically here I talk about the canonical Gospels, and even narrowing it down further, I talk about the Synoptic Gospels for reasons that I can expand upon in a minute. But I was trying to figure out why there is a tendency for us to imagine communities behind these texts. Now, some of it is obvious. We like to try to reconstruct as much of early Christian history as we can. And so to think about different churches that may have used these Gospels makes a fair amount of sense. We do know eventually this is how they are used. It's how they're used today. But that seemed a little contrary to my mind to how we talk about literature saying classics, right? We don't talk about Philodemus's assumed community as the example I give in the text, or someone like Philo, who are also talking about religion, talking about famous figures, but not, or philosophy, but not, we don't really try to reconstruct whatever religious community was around them. So it seemed to me that we were sort of making a category mistake to some extent, in the sense that we were just assuming that when the gospel writers were writing, they were writing for communities. So I wanted to explore that a little bit more. And what I came up with in the book is that we probably are overestimating the degree to which we can imagine or reconstruct an early Christian community behind these texts. And the reason for that has to do with literacy in the ancient world. It's fairly limited. We probably can imagine a literary community of other people who could read and write around these authors, but to assume that they're just sort of faithfully recording the oral traditions and teachings of Jesus that they're passing on amongst each other might be a step too far, or at the very least, we need to maybe add some complexity to that model. And so I wanted to test what would happen if we imagined a literary community as more primary for these writers rather than a religious one. And so in doing that, I started to identify, as you've asked me to come on and talk about today, different parallels within Greco-Roman literature that I thought were very telling, and revealed that the gospel writers were really participating in something that was very normal in the ancient world, which was not faithfully recording a history per se, but demonstrating the importance of Jesus through literary technique. And so I do a lot of different comparisons with things like the Satyricon, for example, where you have a story about 3 men crucified and an empty tomb, where you have the story of Trimalchio, where he hears a cock crow and predicts his death and has his testament to his friends at a dinner party that they should eat his body after his death. I mean, just to give I'm sure we'll mine down on these examples, and we have talked about some of them before, But those to me suggested that these authors were, maybe we could say, filling in the blanks at times with literary technique, or telling a story the way that audiences would have expected a story to be told in antiquity. In other words, something like The Empty Tomb, which, Richard Miller has also talked about. When you have an empty tomb or a missing body after the death of your hero in a story, or in visual culture as well, so thinking here about something like The Arch of Titus, when you have that kind of apotheosis, would you have it in the Greek novel? It means that that person has a new sort of more exalted status, or we might say kind of superhuman status. They're a god. They've become a god. So little clues like that throughout the story, even things like the birth narratives, when you get to Luke and Matthew, indicating, this extraordinary birth. In Luke, you have clues in terms of cosmology. All of these things you can find elsewhere in Greek and Roman literature. So it wasn't that I was trying to, again, downplay the idea that there were early Christians who appreciated these texts, circulated these texts, found them important. I really wanted to think about what the experience of the writers would have been, and to kind of offer a new perspective where we could maybe have some new conversations in the field around that.
What do you make of Platonizing Christians?
Do you mean like the Gnostic way, or Christians using Plato?
I guess I'm asking about both.
Okay. Well, I think that, going all the way to Paul, Paul is very steeped in philosophy. And, I think some people would say he's a Middle Platonist, to the extent that we use that category. I think, according to some people who study philosophy and, the Roman world, I'm thinking here about Elizabeth Rawson. She points out that Josephus says that anybody who's a Platonist is kind of laughed out of the room by the late 1st century because Stoicism becomes so popular. But you still see some of the aspects of Platonism in terms of things like dualities, which is what comes across in something like the Gospel of John, just off the top of my head. And I don't think these early Christian texts really, they do display an interest in Platonizing ideas, but that's normal for this time period. And I think certainly the Gospel authors, and again, Paul, understand Greek and Roman philosophy. So I think that we have to be aware that a lot of the terminology that maybe gets sort of a theological casting in our translations today, we have to be attentive to whether or not Plato might be an inspiration, or someone, like one of the Stoic authors, or Stoic physics could be involved. And a scholar I really like on this topic is Emma Wasserman, who has several books, and including her dissertation book from a few years ago, where she points out that, there are a lot of strategies, Platonic rhetorical strategies that, for example, Paul uses. And then to the extent that we might imagine the Gospel authors also reflecting on Paul and, again, having these kinds of philosophical conversations, I think that it's very present. Now, what happens later with quote unquote Gnosticism? From what I understand, that term's having a comeback, but I'm still pretty persuaded by Karen King's What is Gnosticism book that identifies that category as a later category that's all tied up with ideas of orthodoxy and heresy. So I think we have to have a more, I think I said this about the Gospels too, but expansive view. I think we want to try to, as much as we can, divorce ourselves from these later categorizations and the later polarizing conversations that happened about orthodoxy and heresy. So I hope that answers your question, but that's where I feel.
It does.
That's how I feel about Platonizing Christians.
So would you connect Paul within the Greco-Roman literary milieu?
Yeah, that's how he's been trained. And I would say that even since I wrote the book, and, I've had a few new articles come out, and I'm writing 2 or 3 monographs right now simultaneously, which is probably a bad idea. But I am, I have too many ideas. But one thing I'm starting to lean toward more is, back to kind of this principle of how were these writers trained, or how did they go to school? And I think that tends to answer a lot, because I always want to be aware that ancient authors didn't have the same access to everything we have access to. And especially now with databases and the Loeb Classical Library and things like that, it's very easy for me to be like, oh, that reminds me of this thing, or to use the TLG to like look up words. And then I just assume somebody had access to a particular text. I think I have to be careful about that. And also, we have to be aware that there are a lot of texts that we've lost, obviously. So Phlegon of Trails that we've talked about before, or Tralles that we've talked about before, apparently he wrote about Christians, but that's lost, for example. And so I'm interested in thinking more about trends that I could identify maybe in education or training that would tell me something about why a certain motif or topos makes its way into the way that an ancient writer constructs their narrative. So somebody like Plato, or for example, Homer, I can anticipate Paul, who clearly knows Greek. He's been trained in, the rhetorical exercises. He seems to be well aware, of those traditions, and he's deploying them and using the terminology. I don't know that I can always, I can pretty much tell he's read the Republic, for instance. But like, of course, right? So some of those texts, I think you can have a reasonable assumption that they would have had homework assignments where they would have to read Euripides, Homer, Plato. And so there, I think you can start to see a general kind of training and ethos of education. And so that's where I kind of lie with Paul. I think you can see with him that he has been trained in certain traditional ways for the rhetorical exercises, with the caveat that I don't think we know as much about what it meant to be a Pharisee in the diaspora and to be educated at the time, which is also something that I've been trying to work on. Often we have to go to rabbinic literature to try to reconstruct some of that history, but that's always a bit perilous, whether it's within Jewish studies or Christian studies. So one thing I'm particularly interested in these days is the reputation of Tarsus as an educational center in antiquity, because it's Acts that tells us Paul is from Tarsus. Paul doesn't tell us that himself, but Tarsus was a center of learning, a well-known area where philosophy was a big deal, right? So to be able to reconstruct, who else is from Tarsus? We know some ancient librarians who were from Tarsus, and other figures, and what we mean by Tarsus is one thing, for example, that I think is an interesting new path to take.
How is Mark's gospel not much help?
Okay, so, Mark is it's my favorite gospel, I think. And in part because it's doing something very curious, which is, he has this construction of Jesus where no one seems to understand who he is for half of the gospel. He performs these acts or gives these teachings or does something else that's wondrous. And, these crowds and the disciples are like, who is this guy, over and over again? Also, having translated some of it I had an ambition at one point to do a commentary and translation. So, back in the day, I was trying to go through it very carefully to do a translation. And, the sentence structures and, its composition is a little strange in some ways. It kind of reminded me of something like the Tablet of Cebes. And so looking at it that way, if you're trying to reconstruct a Christian community, it doesn't give you much, actually. To do any of that kind of work, I think you have to sort of call him eschatological, or you have to do a comparison with somebody like Matthew or Luke to say, how do they change him? And then you can kind of reverse engineer some claims about Mark and community. But I don't think Mark itself as a gospel, if you want to do a kind of methodological mirror reading of, what community constructed this gospel based on Jesus's teachings, based on the structure, I find that exceptionally odd in a way to try to do with this particular text, because the esotericism seems to be the point. And more recently, I wrote a piece for the new quest, or the next quest for the historical Jesus, where I pointed out actually what the Gospel of Mark reminds me of is what you see in Homer and Virgil when the hero is I don't know if misrecognized is a word off the top. I think it is. I think I used it. But he's not recognized right away, especially when he comes home, which is interesting for, we have a teaching of Jesus saying, a prophet's not appreciated, especially in his hometown. So I think that whole tenor of the gospel is very interesting, but also back to what we were saying with education, really corresponds with a technique that you would have learned in school. Somebody would have noticed that Homer and other writers have this idea of the hero who is not recognized immediately. The example I gave in the piece I wrote for the next quest was Virgil and the various heroes that come into town, and you have crowds that are bewildered. The word that is often used is thalma, which is also the word that's used in Mark. And so we've been very influenced historically by this scholar named William Verda, who talked about the messianic secret. And so instead of talking about literary technique, Verda talked about kind of the psychology of Jesus. I don't know if he was like a Freudian, I'm not quite sure, but he talks about the psychology of Jesus and the theological aim of having Jesus not recognized being something we might call like a low Christology, for example, just to kind of give a brief description. And so then you could use that to say, well, this was a Christian community with a low Christology that, is interested in Jesus's suffering and human processes. But I don't think that's what's going on in terms of literary technique. That's a theological interpretation that I think is relevant to a much later understanding of that gospel, not its composition. So I think that Mark's not much help for community, but it is interesting in terms of literary technique.
In the reverse, is it helpful in kind of speaking on the literary technique you just mentioned in terms of like understanding the Greco-Roman connections?
Yeah, I think that Mark and Luke probably, to my mind, are the most obvious in that realm. I think that they demonstrate the most adherence to a certain kind of technique, at least in my mind. And Luke is more obvious, more obviously an ancient biography in terms of its structure with like a birth narrative and, so forth. So I think that they definitely demonstrate that. I mean, you can make the case for the others as well if we're just talking about the canon. But maybe it's not quite as transparent structurally as it is, again, at least in my mind, with Mark and Luke. But that's something people would debate.
What was the romantic Big Bang and the inheritance of the German methodology?
Well, one thing I also did in the book was not just focus on the ancient world, but ask the question, well, how did we get here? Like at what point can we identify in the history of scholarship where it made sense to talk about communities instead of authors? And one place that I ended up really focusing in on was the German Romantic movement, which is, if you think about the academy itself, it's not critical study of religion is not that old, actually. And when we think about the university system today, it is inspired or informed or an inheritor of what was going on in the German universities of the Romantic period as well. And one strategy of the Romantic period that had all kinds of relevance for things like nationalism, which we don't have to get into, but was this idea of retrieving oral stories from different folk, so different peoples. And so this was something that the Germans did with the example I give in the book is the Grimm fairy tales. For example, it's something everybody is pretty much familiar with, but that was an attempt to retrieve the otherwise unrecorded oral stories of the German people. Now you mine down into that, and there have been many books. It turns out the Grimm brothers weren't really formally trained. They stole a lot of stories from the French, but like whatever, we'll bracket that for a second. But this idea that you could find the oral stories of a people, whether it's Shakespeare with, the Brits, or it's the Grimm brothers with the Germans and so forth. And so those methodologies, I think you can see how they were then applied to the Gospels as well at a time when strict disciplinarity wasn't really a thing. If you were a scholar of literature, ancient literature, there would be no problem with you sort of dancing around, maybe trying one methodology with German literature and then trying the same thing with the Gospels. And so the idea of a spokesperson, a genius author who represents, the oral stories of the folk was very much something that was normalized as a methodology. at a time when the critical study of the Bible is coming up. And so therefore, I think reinforced this idea that if we're going to recreate early Christian history, that this was a legitimate means of doing so without really having to mine down, in the case of the Gospels, into actually, the technique and the writing habits and networks of those authors.
What is Herder's schema for language and myth foregrounds?
Well, he was one of the main examples that I gave, and he's fairly famous. I think one of the texts that I talk about in that chapter is his spirit of Hebrew poetry, the Geist of Hebrew poetry. And so one thing that he puts forward is the idea that, and this was not exclusive to Herder. This was something that was very common in German Romantic thinking, but that language itself really embodied a people and could explain a lot about those people. So I'm not going to say everything he concludes about the Jewish people, which he's talking about. He's in some ways complimentary of the active form of the language and the verbs and how crackly it is. He talks about at one point, and but he makes some kind of, I would say, unsavory conclusions about Jewish people as a result of those observations. And this is part of a larger schema where there was an attempt in some corners of German scholarship to reconstruct Aryan history, but extract Jewish history from that trajectory. So there's a lot going on there that I can't quite get into. But the idea that language represents a people became part, I think, of what was going on with early Christianity, in particular, translation. So there is a tradition that continues today where if you're going to translate New Testament Greek, and that's the terminology that's used, you need a different lexicon than what you would use in, say, a classics course where you're translating Koine from someone else, or even just, translating, Epictetus, just to throw it off the top of my head. You're going to use a different dictionary because words mean different things for Christians. And that effectively, first of all, that's not the case. Right? You can actually understand Paul much better, or Mark much better, if you use what we call the middle little, the Liddell and Scott. Like if you use an actual Greek dictionary that has the definitions that everybody's using, because Paul's borrowing words like ecclesia from a pre-existent vocabulary and he's deploying it in the same way. There's just later theological interpretations of certain words that then make their way into a New Testament lexicon. But that does not get you at what we're talking about here, which is Christian beginnings, right? Like how do we reconstruct the development of this movement? So this idea that there's a separate language for Christianity, that it has its own people and language, really established this idea of Christian nationalism in a sense, that I think gives it a foundation by making these kinds of claims about it in antiquity that puts it on par with what we're talking about with, Herder trying to identify the language of the Jewish people or the language of the German people. And then you have a language of Christians, especially in antiquity, which is, I think, all part of a project of drawing these divisions that end up having all kinds of, as you know, pernicious effects in history, culminating especially in World War II.
What connections do you see between Luke and Virgil?
So I see this Thalma motif we were talking about in particular. And, Virgil deploys it. He most likely gets it also from Homer as a literary technique. But I give the example of Camilla in this piece that I wrote that I mentioned before called City and Country for the Next Quest. Because Camilla is a very subversive figure. She's a woman, but she's a warrior. And over again, when she appears, she's described as causing bewilderment and wonder to the people who see her. And the language is very, very similar to the Gospel of Mark when Jesus performs a certain kind of action and the people around him are bewildered and struck by wonder. And so I actually just go through in that piece, and I think I give maybe 3 or 4 examples where you can compare and contrast how someone like Virgil is using the same sort of language. He's writing in Latin, obviously, but it's the same kind of motif, right? And I picked Camilla in particular because I liked that idea of the figure being also subversive, that the hero is also subversive in some way. So Camilla being a woman who's a warrior, and Jesus being a Messiah who's crucified, right? So you have a certain inversion of expectation as well with these two figures. So I thought that was a really fruitful way to reimagine what Mark's objectives as a writer might have been. And the other nice thing about Virgil, too, is, obviously we're talking about writing in a similar time period. So not just going all the way back to Homer. Perfectly good reasons to do that. But also demonstrating that Mark, I don't know, we might say is like au courant in his approach to trying to appeal to a readership of some kind.
Do you see not only Luke, but Matthew having a genealogy of Jesus being akin to Greco-Roman genealogies of their dying rising gods? If so, what examples could you refer to for this?
The dying and rising god motif is something I'd want to think more about. I know that kind of comes in and out of fashion at times. Certainly the kind of genealogy that's given in both. They're interesting for their own reasons, each one of them. But that is very typical, I think, particularly in something, not only the biographical tradition, but also, to me, the paradoxographical tradition. Let me try to say that again without tripping over it. The paradoxographical tradition. Because you do see in paradoxography this tendency to, I'm thinking about Luke here in particular, account for time according to when like such and such a council was in office in such and such a time, this extraordinary thing happened. And you see that kind of recording with birth narratives too. It's also interesting to me, and I apologize for kind of going off a track here a little bit, but
That's
even something like Luke's preface, right? That kind of dedication we see in the writings of people like retired generals or physicians who will say something like, I've read all these books that claim to have cures for X, Y, and Z. And after reading all of these, I've decided, patron X, to write you a more thorough account of how to deal with gout or whatever it is, right? There's at least one example I can think of off the top of my head where that happens. And so you are seeing, whatever the influence was, a paradoxographical tradition, a biographical tradition, they're fitting into it. One thing to go off track a little bit, but that also occurs to me, is that something like Luke's preface, which obviously, is part of this opening series of vignettes about Jesus's birth, or, right before that, that kind of structure you also see in the works of people like ancient physicians who will say something along the lines of, I've read a variety of accounts of how to do a particular kind of medicinal treatment or particular kinds of healing. So the accounts of other physicians, and then a mention of patron X. And then I'll say, but I have put together a more faithful accounting of how to treat this particular problem. So I actually could show you one example that this example I actually got from Francois Bauvin's Hermania commentary on the Gospel of Luke. He kind of embedded it in a footnote, but I think that it's helpful. So hold on one second. Let me share screen if that's okay.
Sure.
Okay. Right, so ignore everything else. I gotta open this one. Can you see this?
Not yet. I see it now.
So this is from Dioscorides from the 1st century CE. Although many reports have been made, not only in the past but also recently, about the production, effects, and testing of medicines, I nevertheless intend to instruct you, dear Arios, about them. The decisions to undertake such a thing is neither needless nor injudicious, for some of my predecessors have not completed their works, and others have written most things down from hearsay. So if you're familiar with Luke's preface, this is going to seem pretty familiar to you in terms of structure, right?
Oh,
so
yeah.
That's the kind of thing in thinking about Matthew or Luke, or thinking about, again, how they're structuring their pieces, whether it's something like the genealogies or something like this preface.
there's a certain familiarity there. So not saying that I necessarily know Luke read, a bunch of treatments of physicians, but isn't it interesting that later on Luke is associated with being a physician, right? And you see this kind of preface, you can start to understand why those sorts of conclusions might have seemed natural to a Greek speaker in antiquity. Like, well, we see this kind of preface all the time from physicians. He uses medical terminology elsewhere. He must be a physician, right? So it's not something I would necessarily put in print, but it's the kind of thought experiment I think is interesting with those kinds of questions.
Sure. What do we know about authorship in antiquity in general?
Well, we have to rely to some extent on the testimony of some pretty elite individuals. And here I mean elite in terms of also economics as well as social standing. So, we're a little bit limited to some extent in imagining how some of these practices might have, we might say trickled down to other tiers of society. I think that there are scholars like Candida Moss and John Kloppenborg who have done a lot of great work on this to help us understand the activities of, or Bill Arnall too comes to mind, about scribes, ancient scribes, or in Candida Moss's case, her recent book on enslaved writers and enslaved individuals having to participate in authorship practices. So I think attentiveness to those currents are very important as well. But that writing, reading at a level that we see displayed in something even like the Gospels was the purview of very few, relatively speaking. Obviously, there's no requirement to go to school, and so you have to have a certain amount of latitude in your life, your social standing, to participate in that kind of activity, to spend the time that it would take to read and write. If you're economically elite, you're going to enslave people or employ people to do a lot of that work for you. Actually, we see this with Paul, and Moss has written an article about this, where Paul at one point says, look what large letters I'm using. When I write with my own hand, it means that he had a scribe, whether, he funded it or a patron funded it. This is a laborious process in many ways that not everybody would participate on their own. And then you also have those people like enslaved individuals who are trained in these practices, not at their own liberty, but in order to serve some other function in a household for an individual who wants to participate in these practices for whatever reason. And then in the 2nd century, we do have some evidence here. I'm thinking about the work of someone like David Constan, of more people, probably because of economic reasons, but it's something that I'd want to, work some more on in terms of research, where you do have a wider readership in some cases. Or I'm thinking here just off the top of my head about magical papyri, or if you go to Pompeii, you see graffiti, on the walls that's quoting Homer. You have more people participating in these kinds of activities in a limited sense. They maybe aren't going to go out and write prose literature, but they're familiar well enough because of their exposure in the theater, because of their exposure via social expectations of literacy. We see some evidence of some more people being literate to some degree. So there have been arguments in the past about maybe this is where we place the gospel authors. Maybe they're kind of a mid-tier or something like that. This requires a little bit more consideration. But in terms of those reading and writing practices, we have to imagine a pretty narrow scope of people. And this is back to this idea of a literary network, having those conversations, having that particular training, fulfilling certain expectations relative to that literary training itself. So it's fairly limited and also laborious.
Who are the primitive Christians?
This is a term that you see quite often in early Christian scholarship or scholarship on early Christianity and Christian origins. It's something that I don't like because I think this idea of primitive buys into a lot of pernicious language related to what we were talking about in terms of, German Romanticism, and also constructions of ancient peoples. One place where I see this as really problematic is actually at the intersection of cognitive science and the study of religion. I mean, we tend to, because we think of people as primitive or ancient, we can start to make all kinds of claims because that means they're different, right? So they must have had different ways of memorizing than we did. And like we might not have evidence for that, but it's something that we might state because we other them by calling them primitive. And obviously the term primitive for any peoples is fairly insulting and not descriptive of anything except, a self-importance of contemporary ideas of culture. So I like to stay away from it. I think that the term itself comes in part from this idea of like the Christian in German. So it's a way to simultaneously create a sense of they're almost childlike, which back to Herder is something he says about Jewish people, actually. So a childlike mentality, or create more antiquity, and the idea of primitive being truly ancient for Christianity than just talking about some people interested in Jesus, right? So I think depending on when and how it's used, it is participating in a lot of different kinds of discourses that I think are across the board problematic. And it is just a term, whether we're talking about the study of religion and Christian origins or in general, that we just should not use.
Can you tell us about Irene Perano's tracing the frequency with which Roman writers engaged in the practice of creating quasi-fictional scenarios centered on untold episodes and unexplored existing narratives?
So she wrote an interesting book called The Roman Fake. Is that the one that you're thinking of here?
I think so.
Yeah. So she, I think she goes by Perano Garrison now as well. But she wrote a book. I think there's a longer title, but there's something about the Roman fake. And she's writing about this interesting practice of basically imitating other authors. I mean, the book deals with a lot of different subjects. And Tom Goy's book, too, on anonymous writing with Harvard University Press is another, contribution to this general field of thinking about our categories. But we have to remember that in the Second Sophistic, which is something that, we have to place early Christian literature within that ambit, but also in antiquity, it was quite common to write in the name of other people. It was quite common to imitate other writers. There's nothing like copyright in antiquity per se. Plagiarism, you're not going to get knocked for that. In fact, I would say it's celebrated in many contexts in antiquity. If you can imitate the greats, that's a good thing, right? So if you can show proper emulation of great authors with your own sort of innovations and twist, that's a good thing. And so also trading on the name and recognition of an established literary figure is also going to be a good thing. This is why by the 2nd century, we get so many imitators of Paul and Paul's letters. There's a trade-off on him as sort of this foundational figure of early Christianity by the 2nd, 3rd century. So she deals with that, how do we, and I'm not going to take responsibility for explaining her whole thesis, but that is what she points out for us. And she's somebody who is influential to my book as well, because she helps us understand that writing practice as not being something offensive or something that we should feel discomfort about, but that imitation, fakeness, this is something that is a good way to help us reconceptualize what exactly is going on when, say, Matthew takes Mark and doesn't change a lot, right? He just kind of puts his own spin on it. These kinds of activities were very normal.
What does Dio Chrysostom say about teachers teaching on street corners?
Oh, gosh. What I remember is that don't use them. So I think I might have talked about this in the book in terms of writing practices and like literary practices in general. Like, how do you go to school, essentially? Like, that was one thing that I wanted to address. This is something Rawson talks about, too. That you could, ideally, you're going to be educated in Rome or in Athens by an established grammaticos or some other kind of teacher, or you're going to have one in your house. Interesting if you're wealthy enough. Interestingly, by the time you get to someone like Augustine, he's like, I didn't need a tutor. I was just like so innately intelligent that I just like magically learned to read and I understood everything. So you get different variations on how this happened. But there were these, speakers on street corners as well as teachers on street corners according to these authors, that you could hire as a teacher for the day, or, like might gather like a group together to do some pontificating. And especially if they're affordable, that's probably a sign they're no good. So that's what I remember, but I would have to look up the specific passage.
What does Pliny say about knowledge and memorization of excerpts and phrases?
He talks about this at various points, but one area that I recall is essentially what we might call publication, in a sense. So this would be a way that people would exchange within their literary networks their writings or their ideas. And you might excerpt a friend's writing in your own work, or memorize it as part of a speech. But this was a way to essentially put forward, or sort of like soft launch somebody's ideas in antiquity. So he talks about it in that sense, I think, at various points. And it gives us an idea of how these networks would have exchanged their writings, would have appreciated them. Someone else who talks about this too is Cicero. So we do see these ancient authors actually identify their own networks. And there's been some great work. Josh Howley too has done this with Aulus Gellius, about how, within his own circle, he's quoting some people that we might then imagine or be able to reconstruct who are part of his school in Athens. So when we see this kind of repetition of phrases and memorization of one another's poetry or writings, it gives us some interesting clues to how these people were interacting and, again, sort of soft launching or publishing their works.
How was Philo of Alexandria like Pliny and Quintilian, and how were Greek Jewish scholars indistinguishable from non-Jewish Greek intellectuals?
Well, Philo is elite in that sense of being economically elite and socially elite. I mean, he's related to the royal family by marriage. And, he's in Alexandria, a huge intellectual hub, obviously. And I would also class him among the Middle Platonists. I had to take a Greek class. I can tell you he's very hard to translate. So he's also participating in a kind of, showcasing of his literary skill that is common among the truly elite and talented of this period. So he's, he demonstrates the same kind of learning, the same kinds of potential, the same kinds of craftsmanship that you hear from someone like Quintilian, who talks to us. He's one of the big sources on how education worked and how literacy worked in antiquity. But again, among this kind of rarefied group to some extent. I think if I could kind of tweak a little bit, he's indistinguishable in terms of objective craft technique. Skill, right? Education. What his difference is, which I think is key, is that he is participating in something that Arthur Urbano has talked about, which is whether it's Philo or Josephus and Paul, actually, but a lot of talented Jewish writers and thinkers of this period trying to point out that if you really love Plato, well, Moses said it first. The great antiquity of Judaism in this period, the knowledge that something like the Hebrew scriptures are older than anything else that anybody's claiming. And remember, Rome's got to have a little bit of self-consciousness here because they're stealing everything from the Greeks, and they have really no right to. They also have, a great fondness for North Africa and for Egyptian culture, which they, translate into the built environment by like taking things like obelisks, right? And, borrowing off of those cultural currents. And so to have knowledge that here is a tradition, a set of holy books, and a people with even greater antiquity is something that we see Josephus, Philo, Paul, and so forth use to argue that they really do. They are the holders and the true inheritors of a cultural tradition that has great currency in the 1st and 2nd centuries. And I think that this is really important for quite a few reasons. Among them is the attractiveness of Paul's message, for example, or the Gospels. Why would anybody care, right? If you're not yourself, somebody who believes in a Jewish Messiah or, has encountered Jesus yourself, why would you care if you're in Rome, for example? Well, Paul is offering a greater antiquity and genealogy than perhaps some families could claim for themselves in the first or second centuries, at a time when being able to identify, your family lineage is a huge deal, as we talked about with Matthew or Luke. But say you're an Ostian merchant who, you have a family tree that you can trace back to some extent, but you're kind of new money. To be able to claim, that you are an adopted son of Abraham is going to make you more ancient than any other family, right, in town. And so I think that tied to a greater antiquity, a deeper genealogy, a more ancient peoples, a more, ancient set of scriptures. These are scriptures that were also used for purposes like dream interpretation. We know that Judeans were doing this as well. I think it helps us explain a little bit why there was an interest in Judaism in this period, and sort of this cultural competition that was going on. So Philo embodies some of that as well.
What is the Satirica, and what links the Gospels with it?
This is a text that is variously dated to the 1st or 2nd centuries. It's attributed to somebody in the sort of ambit of Nero at times, but more recent scholarship, like Ulrich Roth's work on it in the Classical Quarterly, has, I think, pretty conclusively demonstrated that it's probably an anonymous writer in the 2nd century. But it's a series of vignettes that are somewhat inspired by something called Milesian tales. So it's sort of embodying this idea of repetition we've talked about, or emulation of other stories. But it's kind of a series of satirizing accounts of life in this period through various characters and different kinds of situations. So hence Satyricon, it's a satire. So the interesting thing about it to me, and the way I use it in the book, is we mentioned a couple of scenes already, but one is this character Trimalchio. And there's so much going on with Trimalchio. Another scholar that I can recommend on Trimalchio and what's called the Scena is John Bodell. So John Bodell and Ulrich Roth have done a lot of great work on this. But Trimalchio is this really ridiculous character. He's kind of new money, like we were just talking about. He can't read or write, but he has people around him who can. He has these like ornate dinner parties, and he has this big fancy house, but he does everything a little bit wrong. Like if everybody's going to play, like a ball game, he doesn't quite know the rules. If he tries to be fancy and put on airs, he gets it a little bit wrong because he just doesn't quite know what he's doing. And so that's where the humor, he's like a satirization of a rich, fancy person. But he has this one scene where he has a dinner party. He hears a cock crow. He assumes that is a sign of death, and he starts to freak out. And at his dinner party, he says that he's going to impart his last will and testament to his friends, that he wants them to eat his body after he dies. So it's very much kind of a funerary meal sort of setting, which is interesting when you compare the literary approach of the Gospels, right? There's a lot more to say about the so-called Last Supper. I've written elsewhere about how the Last Supper seems to actually come from Paul, who claims it's a divination experience. So there's some stuff to unpack there. But if we're thinking about a literary approach, this idea of a funerary meal exists. Whether, again, the Satyricon is 1st century or 2nd century, there's a way to write that story. And you see that in something like the Satyricon, and then obviously in the Gospels. The other thing that I zero in on in that set of stories is what's called the Woman of Ephesus. And so this is a story about a woman whose husband dies, he's entombed, and she and her maid go to the tomb, and she's weeping in the tomb over his dead body. And there's a Roman soldier who has been tasked with guarding 3 men crucified. So you have 3 crosses with 3 men crucified, and he's there guarding the bodies to make sure the families don't come and take the bodies down off the cross. He hears this woman sobbing in the tomb. He goes inside. He tries to comfort her. He ends up bringing her food and wine. They eat and drink, and then you can guess what happens next. I won't say. There's a suggestion, like what's the thing that your mind tends to go to when you have a full stomach and you're a little drunk? In other words, like, she gets over the dead husband pretty quick. And so after 3 days and 3 nights, they come out of the tomb after their little sojourn. And he sees that one of the men on the cross has been taken down. The family has come and stolen the body. And so he starts freaking out because he knows, like, it's a death sentence for him. He abandoned his post. But then they concoct the idea of taking the dead husband's body, leaving the tomb empty, and putting the dead husband's body on the cross because it's, the right decomposition and it's the right amount of time. I mean, they don't say this in the story, but that's the implication. I think what the story says is, why not make a dead man useful? So put that guy's body up on the cross to hide that he abandoned his post, and then they can go right off in the sunset together. But obviously, these motifs of like three men on the cross, the soldier, the empty tomb, some of it is implied, but the imagery is all there, right? So again, you have this chicken and egg argument. If it's a first century text, are the Gospels aware of this? And so they're reconstructing some formula. And the Widow of Ephesus is a Milesian tale. So even there, right, like there might be some aspects of this that the Gospel writers are aware of. Or is it that the Satyricon is a second century writing? If it is the case that it's anonymous second century writing, is it
reversing the dependence?
Right. Like, is it making fun? And it's a satire, right? So is it making fun? It's read the Gospels, and it's taking a Milesian tale and coupling it with the Gospels and making fun of the Gospels. It's an interesting puzzle. You're not going to solve it. You can weigh averages for what seems more plausible. I mean, again, with the title Satyricon, I would say that the latter is probably more plausible. But you can see where you get the idea that there are a lot of stories out there that you can borrow from, right? Or there are a lot of motifs that are going to both entertain and inform in antiquity that don't require what we started with, which is, this idea that the Gospel writers are just faithfully recording some oral history of a Christian folk. That to me is, I do think there's a kernel of truth in the idea that these texts obviously were used within Christian communities. I'm not denying that. But that doesn't necessarily account for their composition and their authorship when you make these kinds of comparisons that we've talked about today.
So you think that it's more probable that the Satyricon is kind of satirizing the Gospels?
Yeah, I'm gonna regret answering that, but yeah, I always like to hedge my bets, but I think I have a tendency to think that we have a lot. I think we probably have more texts from outside a Christian ambit in the second century, for example, that are aware of gospel literature and making a parody or satirizing it, than we can either, really reconstruct in terms of like scholarly expectation, or maybe it's a little uncomfortable, right? To figure out that like, oh, people are reading the Gospels, and other than like Celsus, right? Like Contra Celsum, like where Celsus is clearly like not feeling it with the Gospels, like they were just not accepted, right? Or Christian literature was really kind of given side eye in the second century by many elites who then encounter it again, like these educated elites that we're talking about are cultural elites. So off the top of my head, Satyricon, if it is second century, could be making fun of Christianity. We already know Lucian is doing it. He explicitly does it in something like Peregrinus. I mentioned Phlegon. He's aware of it, and he basically lumps it in with paradoxography from what we can understand, but that's a reconstruction. I know that there are scholars who dance with the idea that P.G. Walsh did this. I am not related to P.G. Walsh, but great scholar. And I think, I don't want to speak for Joel Relihan, but I think, I could have a conversation with him about it. But it's possible that Apuleius, the Golden Ass, is aware of early Christianity and maybe looking askance at it. So there's a list, right? There are a few authors who are even either explicitly doing it, or I think you can say they're making a little bit of fun.
I've also wondered if anyone's compared to Satyricon about those 3 crucified guys with Josephus, because in his autobiography about the 2 men die, 1 guy survives after Josephus begged Titus to let them to have them taken down from the cross and have a physician tend to them.
That's an interesting point. So, I mean, I was actually thinking about, it's ironic, I was thinking about it this morning. I didn't know we were going to talk about this, but when I read the Satyricon for the first time and started putting this together, I was actually at a research library that I'm going to go to in a few weeks. So I was thinking about the last time I was there, driving in today, because when I discovered that comparison, I was like, well, surely somebody wrote about this, like there's got to be like, a few articles out there about this, or like a book chapter somewhere. And I just couldn't find it. And I was at a research library where I could spend all day, like looking through a database and doing searches and like going into the stacks and pulling books. And it was sort of a marvel to me that I couldn't find it. So that's the kind of conversation I would like to see people have. But it might be related to this, hypothesis I just threw out that, when it's making fun of early Christianity, it's a little, it's complicated to think about and write about. And to bring Josephus into it, I mean, obviously that's been something. Is it Steve Mason who wrote a book about Josephus and the Gospels? I might be misremembering that. But there has been a movement along those lines. To think about how these motifs cross this kind of literature. So that would be
he talks about Luke's use of Josephus.
Yeah.
So it makes me wonder, it does make me, and Josephus in the New Testament, I think that's what it's called. It makes me wonder if the Satyricon could be alternatively making fun of Josephus, or maybe it's making fun of both, assuming it really was written in the 2nd century though.
Yeah, so the argument for the 2nd century, if you have a second, do you have a second?
Sure.
Why?
Let's talk about it.
Okay, so I'm using the work of Ulrich Roth here. So I recommend anybody who's interested, read the source, like don't trust me, go read the article because you're relying on my interpretation, which, I don't know if I trust myself half the time. But Ulrich Roth wrote for the Classical Quarterly, I think more than one article, but wrote one article about how there are 3 manumitted enslaved persons referenced in the Satyricon. And they have names, something like Star. I can't remember the other 2. I don't want to guess, but I know one was Star. But anyway, in Pliny's letters, so this is Pliny of Pliny and Trajan. In Pliny's letters, he manumits 3 enslaved persons with the same names. So the conclusion is, well, whoever wrote the Satyricon was actually reading Pliny, because it's just too coincidental unless you want to start, building a scaffold that tries to argue that Pliny is naming, enslaved persons after the Satyricon. I guess you could make that case, but you see what I mean. Like there are other arguments in this article to make the case that the Satyricon is not a 1st century, Neronian product, but an anonymous series of vignettes from the 2nd century reflecting on things like Pliny's letters. What I would recommend, so this is probably work I'm going to have to do now, that I say it, is figure out who else is in Pliny's circle, right? That you might be able to find other evidence within the Satyricon of an engagement with a particular literary circle of people. And that would, I think, send you further down that path of trying to figure out how do I date this thing. So a combination of that kind of work plus looking at a manuscript tradition to the extent that you can reconstruct it would be how you start to figure out, how do I confirm this? But that's why I found Ulrich Roth's work very convincing for the Pliny connection. That helped me, essentially abandon the 1st century idea in my own mind. So that's where that comes from. So if you bring in Josephus to that, again, another kind of interesting crossover with the caution that we can't always assume everybody had everything that we're thinking of. So that's why I like to, in terms of texts, so that's why I like to think in terms of tropes or topoi or kind of broadly on technique. So the literary borrowings from Greco-Roman literature that you see in Jewish writings or Christian writings, it's all Greco-Roman literature. And that's really kind of the message at end, is that, they're all sort of using similar kinds of style and structure because that's how they've been trained.
Can you tell us about the popularity of resurrection empty tomb narratives among figures like Flagon of Trellis?
Yeah, so that's really, I don't want to step on Richard Miller too much. That's really his book on this motif. I just add to it in my book. I found his work interesting, and then I found more examples. Flagon has some examples of, he likes ghosts, like amorous ghosts. So it's interesting that seems to be a big theme in antiquity as well. Because it's not just ghosts, but it's ghosts that, are still tied to their bodies in some way. So he has some of that kind of discussion, but he also has accounts of, other bodies that are missing. And the assumption, again, there is usually that if the physical body is gone, or if there is some kind of cosmological sign in correspondence with the death of the individual, or something like their cremation, that's a sign of apotheosis or some kind of divination process. So you see this with the idea that, well, a comet shot across the sky when so-and-so died, therefore that was their body going up to heaven. So you have that kind of imagery all over the place, and it's there too.
What is the link between Mark's account of the empty tomb narrative of Callirhoes?
So this is a Greek novel by someone called Keraton. And there's a scene where the presumption, so a lot of these Greek novels are very Shakespearean, in the sense that usually you have star-crossed lovers, or a boy and a girl who grew up together in a small town, and then something happens. It's usually, a pirate kidnapping, or, she's sold off in marriage to somebody else. And so the lover has to find her and bring her home. And so in this particular story, she's presumed to be, have died and been entombed. It turns out that, very Romeo and Juliet, she wasn't actually dead. She's probably in a coma or something like that. But her would-be boyfriend goes to her tomb and sees that her body is missing from the tomb. So he starts crying out, what god has stolen my girlfriend and made her into a god? That has to be the only explanation if her tomb is empty. In reality, some pirates broke into her tomb to make sure there weren't any jewels buried with her, and when they realized she was alive and awake, they took her too. So the story, he has to figure out that she was kidnapped by pirates, and he has to chase her throughout the empire and so forth. But I like that passage because it's particularly interesting that the initial reaction to a empty tomb is, oh, that person's a god, right? Right away, that's not pirates stole her, maybe she's not dead. It goes right to, well, she must be a goddess at this point, or a god has taken her. So that idea of the bodily, we can't quite say resurrection in this case necessarily, but the idea of the physical body absence representing a kind of, I hate to use the word supernatural state because it is natural in their cosmological construction here, but I'll say supernatural to just kind of get the feeling they've become a deity, or they've become a supernatural being. They're no longer tied to their body, but they're still alive in some form.
And I'd like to remind everybody that the link to the origins of early Christian literature will be in the description below, and also in the pinned comment. And with that being said, thank you very much for joining me today, Robyn.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during your live stream. Thank you.